The flag came through on a standard audit cycle. Low priority, unattended queue, the kind of administrative churn that fills the third shift when nothing else is moving. I almost let it sit until morning. I am glad I did not. My name is Pelath Gund. I served as overseer of Sublevel 4 at the Vethori Detention Authority's primary deep facility for 11 years before the incident with the human changed what I understood about my own work. I am writing this account because the authority's review board asked for a personal narrative to accompany the formal documentation, and because I think the formal documentation, as thorough as it is, does not fully capture what it felt like to sit in the monitoring station at the third hour of night shift and understand, for the first time, that I had not been running the observation in my sector. I had only thought I had. The human's designation in our records was Subject 7 Solis W. Her full name, as she had given it during intake, was Warrant Officer Dara Solis, Terran Expeditionary Service, Detachment 3. She had been brought in 41 days prior as a lawful prisoner of the Interstellar Transit Compact, captured during a disputed zone enforcement action in the Pelavar corridor. She was not accused of any violence during the capture. She had not resisted. She had come aboard the arresting vessel and sat down in the holding area and asked, once calmly, when she would be permitted to contact her chain of command. She was told that contact would not be arranged. She said, "Understood." Then she sat quietly for the 11-hour transit to our facility. The arresting officer's report described her as cooperative. That word had come up several times in her file. Cooperative. I had read it when she first arrived and felt the customary relief that comes with a new intake who does not fight the processing. I had read it again when her first behavioral review came back clean. I had read it a third time when the monitoring staff noted in passing that Subject 7 Solis W seemed to have adjusted well to Sublevel 4's regime, which meant she ate what was provided, slept on schedule, and caused no disturbances during cell lights off. In 11 years of overseeing that level, I had learned to appreciate cooperative subjects. They were easy. They let you focus your attention on the ones who weren't. That, as it turned out, was the problem. The audit flag that appeared in my queue at the third hour of night shift was not a security breach. It was not a containment warning. It was a data volume anomaly, specifically, an observation by the automated maintenance system that the behavioral log file associated with Cell 7 Solis W had grown to a size inconsistent with 41 days of recorded standard activity. The log was 22 times larger than the average for a comparable intake period. The automated system had flagged it as a possible recording error, a loop in the passive monitoring feed, and had recommended I review the file before the morning archive compression deleted the overflow data. I pulled the file. It was not a recording error. What I found when I opened Subject 7 Solis W's behavioral log was that the file was not composed primarily of our monitoring data. The bulk of it, the anomalous volume that had tripped the audit, was composed of a second layer of records that our passive monitoring had captured without recognizing what it was capturing. Our system had been watching the human. The human had been taking notes. Let me be precise about what I mean by that, because the review board's preliminary summary described it in terms that I think undersell the specificity of what Solis had done. And specificity is the thing that matters here. She had no instruments. She had no recording device of any kind. Her cell, standard sublevel 4 configuration, contained a sleeping platform, a sanitation alcove, a nutrient dispenser, and one ventilation grill positioned high on the outer wall, approximately 40 centimeters wide by 20 centimeters tall, through which the corridor outside was partially visible. That grill was the only aperture through which she could observe any portion of the facility. The angle was narrow. From her sleeping platform, she could see, at most, a 2-meter section of the corridor wall, the lower half of the guard station alcove across the hall, and if she stood on the platform's edge and pressed herself against the outer wall, a partial sightline to the junction at the corridor's far end. What she had done, in 41 days, using only that grill and whatever she could hear through the ventilation system, was reconstruct my facility from the outside in. She had been doing it in her head. The passive monitoring captured it because she had a habit, not unusual in humans, the research team would later tell me, but striking in its discipline, of working through what she had observed by mouthing the information quietly to herself, barely a whisper. Our audio pickups in her cell were sensitive enough to capture it. The automated system had logged it as low-level vocalizations, non-communicative, noise grade. No one had listened to it. The audit compression routine, treating it as inert data, had simply been accumulating it. I listened to it. The recordings began on day 3 of her detention. Not day 1, not day 2. Day 3, I mention this because the research team later found it significant, and I came to find it significant myself, though for different reasons. The first 2 days she had been silent in the way most new intakes are silent, processing, adjusting, waiting for a pattern to emerge from what was, to her, an unfamiliar environment. By day 3, apparently, she had seen enough of a pattern to begin organizing it. First shift guard rotation, she says in the earliest recording, her voice so low that our system had initially interpreted it as background ventilation noise. Changes at the station alcove approximately 40 minutes after cell lights on. The tall one, the one with the reddish secondary joints, comes off the alcove and goes right, toward the far junction. The short one, the one whose boots scrape, goes left, out of sight. The one who replaces them at the alcove always takes approximately 12 seconds longer to settle than the first one did. 12 to 14 seconds. He adjusts equipment twice. The first one didn't adjust at all. Day 3. She had been in the cell for 72 hours, and she was already cataloging hesitation intervals in shift change transitions. I sat in the monitoring station with the audio feed running, and felt something shift in my understanding of the last 41 days, like a floor settling under me into a different geometry. On day 5, she added patrol rhythm. The alcove guard does not patrol a fixed route, she murmured, barely audible even in the cleaned-up recording. He moves, but the movement is not systematic, it's reactive, which means he responds to sound rather than to interval. Footstep in the corridor, he leans out. Nothing unusual, he settles back. The response lag is approximately 4 seconds, meaning his attention resets after roughly 4 seconds of no subsequent input. That's his attention window. 4 seconds. File that. She was talking to herself. She was filing information in her own memory, using vocalization as a retention aid, which is, and I did not know this at the time, I had to ask the research team, not unusual for humans under stress. They think aloud. They narrate to themselves. They do it more under pressure, not less. The research team described it as an externalized cognitive processing loop, which is a technical way of saying that Solis had been, for 41 days, essentially dictating a security analysis of my facility into my own monitoring system. And my monitoring system had politely logged every word of it without anyone thinking to listen. By day 8, she had named the guards. Not their actual designations. She didn't know those. She had given them descriptors, the scraper, the adjuster, the pacer, the quiet one, and later 2 others she named the talker and the new one based on behavioral markers she had identified through the ventilation grill and the audio bleed from the corridor. The scraper was the one with the boot drag. The adjuster was the shift change guard who always rechecked his equipment. The pacer was a third guard who walked the corridor length on a variable interval schedule that Solis had, by day 8, already identified as roughly randomized in a way that clustered between 11 and 17 minutes. She had not identified it as randomized by observing the pattern for a long time. She had identified it by the second day of the pacer's appearance on shift, then spent the subsequent days checking her prediction. She was right. I checked it against the actual patrol logs. The pacer's walk intervals clustered between 11 and 17 minutes. It was a deliberate randomization protocol, which I had implemented precisely, because I knew that fixed patrol intervals were a containment vulnerability. Solis had correctly characterized it as randomized after 2 days of observation, and had then, apparently, decided that the randomization was itself predictable enough to be discounted. The quiet one, she noted on day 8, was different from the others. The quiet one moves without sound, not because he's not small, the footfall weight is significant, but because he has learned to move that way deliberately. That takes practice. That's not a facility guard habit, that's a prior life habit. Whatever he did before this post, it taught him to place his feet carefully. He's also the only one who pauses at my cell door rather than passing. He pauses for about 2 seconds, then moves on. He's checking breathing patterns. He wants to know if I'm awake or asleep. File. The quiet one is the most professionally capable guard on this corridor. If there is ever a problem in this block, he is the one who will handle it correctly. She had been in the cell for 8 days. She had correctly identified my senior floor guard, Senior Warden Tevathan, from his footfall pattern, and the habit of pausing at occupied cell doors that he had developed during 12 years in maximum security containment. That habit was something I valued in Tevathan specifically, and had mentioned in his last performance review. Solis had identified it as a distinguishing professional characteristic in 8 days, from inside a sealed cell, by listening to him walk. I called in the research team at the 5th hour of that night shift. I did not wait for morning. I told the on-call researcher, a specialist named Vethor Evseln from the Behavioral Sciences Division, that I had an anomalous file and needed him in the monitoring station before I made any decisions about how to proceed. He came in wearing his second shift clothes, mildly irritated, and I played him the first recording. By the time I played him day 12, he had stopped being irritated. Day 12 was when Solis began mapping the structural layout. She had figured out, from the audio bleed in the ventilation system, that the corridor outside her cell was not a dead end. She had deduced this from the differential in echo characteristics when guards walked toward the left versus the right. The leftward direction produced a slightly longer reverberation tail, which she had correctly interpreted as indicating a larger connected space, a junction or common area, approximately 25 to 30 meters in that direction. She had verified this hypothesis over 4 days of listening and concluded, on day 12, that there was a secondary corridor branching left at that junction based on the occasional double footfall pattern she heard when guards split and went different ways. She was correct. The junction was 28 meters left of her cell. There was a secondary corridor. The facility, Vethor Evseln said, after I paused the recording on day 12, is a containment facility. She is contained within it. What does she intend to do with this information? I told him that was what I was trying to determine. We listened through day 15, then day 19, then day 23. I played the recordings in order because I felt, sitting there in the blue-lit quiet of the monitoring station, that sequence mattered, that understanding what had happened required understanding the accumulation of it, the day-by-day discipline of a mind that was apparently congenitally incapable of looking at an environment without mapping it. Vethor Evseln sat beside me and said almost nothing. He took notes on his handheld. The notes, I later learned, would become the core documentation for the authorities' formal inquiry into what it classified, after considerable debate among the review board, as Observation Protocol Event Type 7, unsanctioned intelligence collection by a contained subject. On day 15, Solis had added the guard supervisor's round time to her catalog. My round time. She didn't know who I was, of course. She called me the supervisor because the guards, I could hear it in the corridor audio, once I went back and looked, subtly changed posture when I passed. They drew up. Solis had noticed. She had noted that the supervisor's appearance in the corridor occurred irregularly, but that its irregularity had a shape. It clustered in the first hour of each shift, which she had correctly identified as a check-in period, and then again in the last 40 minutes of each shift. She had noted that the guard's vocal register changed when the supervisor was present, slightly more formal, slightly shorter in their exchange latencies. She had inferred from this that the supervisor held evaluative authority over the guards, meaning that the guards were aware that their behavior was being assessed during those windows. She had identified my inspection pattern in 15 days. The supervisor, her recording said, on day 15, in that low-mouthed cadence that I had now been listening to for 4 hours, arrives on a check-in pattern at shift open and shift close. During the middle hours, the guards are essentially unsupervised. Their behavior in the unsupervised window is slightly different, more casual, more variable, slightly slower at the station alcove, but not dramatically different. This suggests either that they are professionally disciplined or that they do not know what they can get away with. Probably both. File. Middle shift window, 2+ hours, is the low oversight period. The low oversight period. She had a name for it. She had been filing it. I sat with that for a moment. This is extraordinary, Vethorivseln said, not for the first time. He had said it after day 8. He had said it again after day 12. Each time he said it, the quality of the word changed, extraordinary, moving from impressed to unsettled to something that had no clean Vethori equivalent but which I recognized, looking at his face, as a close relative of what I was also feeling. I told him I wanted to keep going. We had 26 more days of recording to get through. Day 19. Solis had begun cataloging individual guard stress responses. The adjuster, she had determined, showed elevated movement fragmentation, more small adjustments, more equipment rechecks, on what she had classified as the second and fourth days of each apparent duty cycle. She had inferred a duty cycle from the guard rotation pattern, which gave her enough reference points to identify a recurring interval. The stress elevation on days 2 and 4 she theorized was fatigue-related, with the qualification that she could not rule out an off-duty variable she had no access to. She noted the pattern as a data point, not a conclusion. She was, notably, precise about the distinction. What I observe, she said on day 19, is behavior. What I infer from it is a hypothesis. I file the behavior. I bracket the hypothesis. I do not treat the hypothesis as the observation. Anything past the grill is a model, not a fact. I had been running a detention facility for 11 years. I had trained my monitoring staff. I held quarterly reviews of our observation protocols. And Warrant Officer Dara Solis, 41 days into an indefinite detention with no access to any of our records, had articulated my senior staff's epistemological failure, the conflation of behavioral inference with confirmed data, in a single murmured sentence into a ventilation grill. Vethorivseln was, by this point, not saying much. He had stopped writing notes in the conventional sense and had begun, I noticed, to simply record the audio feed directly onto his research handheld, as if he did not trust himself to summarize what he was hearing without losing something important in the translation. I understood the feeling. On day 21, she had identified the supply delivery schedule. Third delivery in what appears to be a 3-day cycle, she said. Wheeled transport, medium weight load by the sound of it coming from the left side junction. The same 2 voices accompany it each time, not guard voices, different vocal register, more casual, probably logistics staff. Delivery takes approximately 12 minutes from first audible approach to departure. The guards on the alcove change their posture during deliveries. They relax slightly, which means deliveries are a known, expected event rather than a variable. File. Supply delivery is a routine disruption. The corridor attention pattern during those 12 minutes is degraded because everyone knows what it is. I checked our actual delivery logs. The cycle was precisely 3 days. The delivery window averaged 11.5 minutes. The alcove guard's camera angle behavior during deliveries showed exactly the posture shift she had described. They oriented toward the delivery team rather than the cells, a small but real degradation in corridor awareness that I had never formally noted because it had never seemed relevant to anything. It had seemed relevant to Solis on the second delivery she observed. On day 23, she had begun working the structural mapping into a larger picture. The facility has at minimum 3 distinct zones accessible from this corridor level, she said. The primary detention corridor, this one, a service or logistics corridor branching at the left junction, inferred from the wheeled load sound that occurs on what appears to be a supply delivery cycle approximately every third day. And a third zone, I don't have enough data yet, somewhere beyond the right side wall, because the ventilation airflow pattern changes about 18 minutes into the second shift in a way that suggests a large ventilated space is drawing air. Could be a processing area, could be a larger common facility. The airflow change is consistent, not random. I'll keep watching. She was listening to the airflow. I want to pause on that sentence because I think it is the one that lands differently depending on whether you have spent time in detention work or not. In 11 years of running Sublevel 4, I had supervised the installation of passive audio monitoring, thermal imaging, motion sensitivity protocols, behavioral flagging algorithms, and a dedicated neural pattern analysis system that the authority had commissioned at considerable expense. All of it was designed to give me a complete picture of what was happening in the cells below me. The combined cost of those systems, in a single year of operation, exceeded the annual salary of every staff member I supervised. And Warrant Officer Solis, with no budget and no equipment, lying on a platform in a 40-square-meter cell, had determined the existence and approximate location of our intake processing area by noticing that the airflow changed 18 minutes into the second shift. I want to emphasize this point because I think it captures something that the formal documentation, with its clinical language about unsanctioned intelligence collection and observation protocol events, does not fully convey. She was lying on a sleeping platform in a sealed cell with nothing but a ventilation grill and her own attention, and she was listening to the airflow patterns, and she was using them to infer the existence of a large adjacent facility space that she could not see and had never been told about. She was correct. The space was our intake processing area, 40 meters to the right of her cell, separated by 2 containment walls and a security corridor. The airflow change she had noted was the processing area's climate management cycle, which drew from the ventilation network at the start of the second shift, when the area's occupancy sensor registered incoming staff. She had inferred the intake processing area's existence from a change in airflow timing. Vethor Evselm did not say extraordinary this time. He looked at the recording interface and said, quietly, in Vethori standard, "How long has she been doing this?" I told him 41 days, since day 3. He asked, "Is she planning to escape?" It was the obvious question, the one I had been circling since the 3rd hour of the night shift, when I first understood what I was looking at. If the answer was yes, then we had a containment breach preparation in progress, we had an intelligence collection event, and we had a subject who needed to be transferred immediately to a higher security configuration. If the answer was yes, the path forward was procedurally clear. I thought about the recordings. I thought about how she spoke, the flat cataloging cadence, the careful bracketing of observation versus inference, the discipline of the thing. I thought about the fact that she had not in 41 days done anything with any of it. She had not attempted contact with the guards. She had not tested the ventilation grill. She had not attempted to use the low oversight window she had identified. She had simply continued to watch, to listen, and to file. I told Vethor Evselm, "I don't think that's what she's doing." He asked me what I thought she was doing then. I said, "I think she's doing it because she can't stop. I think she looks at an environment and maps it the way we breathe. I don't think she decided to build a security analysis of this facility. I think she looked at the grill on day 3 and there was a pattern visible through it and some part of her reached out and grabbed it. And then the next day there was another pattern and she grabbed that one too." I think she has been doing this her entire life without knowing she was doing it, and she does not have a name for it, and she does not think of it as a skill. I think it is simply what happens when a human looks at a space that might one day need to be survived. Vethorivseln sat with that for a long time. That, he said eventually, is worse. I agreed with him. I still agree with him. The escape planning hypothesis was manageable. A prisoner who is gathering intelligence in order to escape is a prisoner with a plan, and a prisoner with a plan has an objective, and an objective has a shape, and a shape can be anticipated and countered. What I was looking at instead was a prisoner who was gathering intelligence with no objective at all. No plan, no timeline, no terminus. She was doing it the way her body regulated temperature or oxygenated blood, automatically, continuously, because that is what the organism does. To stop her from doing it, you would need to either remove all stimuli, put her in a sensory-sealed cell with no ventilation grill and no audio input, or remove her capacity to process and retain what she observed, which is not something the Vethori Detention Authority does. This is the part of the formal documentation that I think the review board has not fully internalized, even now, and which I want to state plainly in this personal account. There is no containment protocol in the authority's operational manual that addresses a subject whose primary security risk is that she pays attention. We have protocols for violence. We have protocols for contraband. We have protocols for tunnel attempts, for signal attempts, for resistance of various grades. We have nothing for a subject who looks at the guard's schedule through a grill, and after 6 weeks, knows it better than the guards themselves do. Vethorivseln asked, at this point, whether we should interview her directly. It was a reasonable question, and I want to explain why I was initially reluctant to do it, because my reluctance is itself instructive about what the recordings had done to my thinking by the 6th hour of that night shift. I was reluctant because I was not sure what the interview would accomplish. If she had been building an escape plan, an interview would surface indicators: inconsistency, redirected attention, hostility towards specific operational questions. I knew how to read those. But if she was doing what I believed she was doing, if the mapping was automatic, beneath conscious intention, then I was not confident she would have a useful account of it to give. She might not know how much she knew. She might not be aware that the process had been running. The interview might reveal nothing except a cooperative subject who answered questions straightforwardly, and who I then had no clearer picture of than I had before. What ultimately decided me was that Vethorivseln pointed out that we needed to know whether she was aware of the audio pickup, and the only way to determine that was to speak to her. We went to her cell at the 7th hour. It was still dark cycle, cell lights dim. She was on the sleeping platform, but not asleep. I could see, on the cell feed before we entered, that she had been lying with her eyes open, which was characteristic of her rest periods. The monitoring staff had noted it in week 2. She slept in intervals rather than continuous blocks, and during the intervals of wakefulness she was still, not restless. The quiet one had noted in a corridor log that she seemed to be listening during those intervals. He was correct. I opened the cell myself rather than having a guard do it, partly for the information management reason, and partly because I wanted to see her response to someone she had been observing indirectly for 15 days. I was, I admit, curious whether she would react to me with any recognition. She sat up on the platform and looked at me. It was a particular kind of look, not surprised, that was the first thing I noticed, not alarmed, not deferential. Not the particular combination of wariness and performance that most detained subjects produce when a door opens unexpectedly in the dark cycle. She looked at me with an attentiveness that was almost neutral, almost clinical, and then I saw something move through her expression that was so brief I nearly missed it. She recognized me, not me specifically. She recognized that I was the supervisor. I could see it, a small adjustment in posture, a very slight recalibration of attention, the same subtle upward shift I had seen in the guards in the corridor when I passed them. She gave me the same unconscious register shift that my own guards gave me. She had done it in the first 2 seconds of the door opening, before I said anything at all. I introduced myself by title, not by name. I told her this was a routine welfare interview. I asked how she was managing the conditions of her detention. She said the conditions were adequate. She said she would appreciate access to written materials if that was possible, and she asked again whether contact with her chain of command could be arranged. I told her the contact request was still under review. She said, "Understood," in the same level tone she had apparently used in the arresting officer's report. I asked her how she occupied her time. She looked at me for a moment. Not long, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Long enough that Vethor of Seln, standing behind me, later told me he had thought she was about to say something significant. She said, "I think." I asked what she thought about. She said, "The environment, how things work, patterns." She paused. "It's how I stay sharp, old habit." I asked her whether she had found anything interesting to think about in the current environment. She said, "A few things." And then she looked at me with that same level, almost neutral attentiveness, and she said, "The ventilation system has an interesting cycle. I've been trying to work out what's driving the second shift draw." She said it the way someone mentions a mildly engaging puzzle. The way a person remarks conversationally that they have been watching weather patterns from a window. Matter of fact, completely without strategic affect. She was not telling me she had been mapping my facility. She was telling me she had noticed an interesting thing about the airflow, and she was sharing it the way a person shares an observation they found genuinely interesting, because they have no frame of reference in which sharing it is a problem. I do not believe she knew, when she said it, how much she had told me. We left her cell. Vethor of Seln and I stood in the corridor for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "She doesn't know. She genuinely doesn't know how much data she's been processing. She thinks she's been keeping herself occupied." I told him I thought the same, and I told him what that meant. She had been honest with us because from her point of view there was nothing to conceal. She had been thinking about the ventilation pattern. She had been staying sharp. Old habit. She would have said the same thing to anyone who asked, at any point in the 41 days, and she would have meant it, and she would have been telling the complete truth as she understood it. There was no concealment because there was no awareness of what was being concealed. That was not reassuring. We continued through the remaining recordings, days 26 through 41. The work became, in its later stages, more refined. She was by then filling in gaps in her existing map rather than constructing new territory, annotating her earlier hypotheses with follow-up observations, correcting errors, upgrading confidence levels on individual data points. She had a methodology. It was not a formal methodology in any institutional sense. There was no visible training behind it, no apparent framework she had been taught. It seemed to emerge from the same automatic processing that had generated the work in the first place, the same constitutional compulsion to organize the perceived environment into something that could, if necessary, be acted on. On day 30 she had something new, the talker. The talker was a guard who had apparently joined the rotation in the 4th week. He was, Solis noted, a liability. "The talker breaks protocol consistently," she said. "He speaks to the other guards during overlap periods, not just the minimal exchange required for handoff, but sustained conversation. 6 minutes yesterday during a shift change that should take 2. He tells stories. I can hear the rhythm of it if not the content. The quiet one clearly doesn't like it. His response latency is shorter than usual, which in the quiet one means he's managing someone. The adjuster participates because participation is easier than not. File. The talker reduces the alert quality of any rotation he's part of by creating a social engagement zone near the station alcove. The attention goes horizontal, toward the conversation, instead of vertical, toward the corridor." She had named the social dynamics of my guard rotation. I sat with that recording for longer than any of the others up to that point. What struck me was not the analysis. The analysis was correct, and in fact I had made a note about the talker's conversation habit in my own log the week prior, but the framing. She had not described it as a security vulnerability, exactly. She had described it as an attention redistribution, a horizontal instead of vertical orientation. That was not security language. That was the language of someone who thought about attention itself as a resource with directionality, someone who had spent a long time thinking about where awareness goes and what happens when it goes the wrong way. I did not think she had been taught to think that way. I thought she had arrived at it on her own, in cell 7 Solis W, looking through a ventilation grill. On day 38, she had done something that I have thought about almost every day since. She had gone back to the adjuster, the guard with the stress elevation on days 2 and 4 of the duty cycle, and added a compassionate note. That is not too strong a word for it. Her entry reads, "The adjuster day 4 stress markers more pronounced this cycle, movement fragmentation higher than previous cycle. I don't know what's going on for him outside this facility and I won't pretend to. But whatever it is, it's getting worse rather than better and the job is not helping. He's not young. He works hard at this. The performance gap between his good days and his bad days is not discipline, it's load. File under, not a vulnerability to exploit. File under, probably a decent individual who is carrying something heavy." She had been cataloging a guard as a behavioral data point for 38 days. On day 38, she had looked at the data and found a person in it, and made a note to herself not to use him. I sat with that recording for some time. Vethoriv Seln, who had been mostly silent for the last hour, said, "Does she know we can hear her?" I told him we had no indication of that, no. The cell interview had confirmed it. She had no awareness the vocalization was being recorded. All evidence suggested she believed the mouth filing was private. The cell's passive monitoring was, like all sublevel 4 monitoring, not disclosed to subjects during intake. She thought she was thinking aloud. He said, "Then that notation, not a vulnerability to exploit, that was not for us. That was for herself." I said, "Yes, that's what I believe." He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of the monitoring station for a long moment, and then he said, "What kind of creature is she?" She builds a security map of this facility because she physically cannot stop herself from observing and organizing information. She identifies every structural vulnerability, every behavioral gap, every low oversight window. And then, when she finds a vulnerability with a human face, she files it as off-limits and moves on. I didn't have an answer to that. I still don't have a clean one. What I told him was what I had been thinking since I first opened the file. The most dangerous thing about Warrant Officer Dara Solis was not her capability. It was the combination of her capability with her judgment. A subject who could not stop gathering threat-relevant information about every environment she inhabited, and who simultaneously maintained an internal protocol about how that information could and could not be used. That was not a security risk I had a category for. That was something outside our taxonomy entirely. We finished the recordings at the 8th hour, just before the first shift came on. I sent Vethoriv Seln home to write his preliminary analysis. I sat in the monitoring station for another hour on my own, going back through specific passages. Looking at things I had noticed on first pass that I wanted to examine more carefully. One of the things I went back to was her description of me. It was on day 29. She had been refining her picture of the supervisor's movement patterns and had noted, with the same careful bracketing of observation and inference, a detail I had not expected to find. The supervisor moves through this corridor differently than the guards do. The guards are alert, but their alertness is procedural, it's directional, focused at the cell doors, at the monitoring station, at the expected threat vectors. The supervisor moves alert in all directions at once. He looks at the corridor the way I look at rooms. I don't mean that as a criticism. It means he's good at this, and he's been doing it a long time, and something in his background taught him to hold the whole space rather than the expected parts of it. What that means for me is that the supervisor is not going to miss something because he wasn't looking in the right direction. What that also means is that he and I are using the same processing loop on the same space, and he has resources I don't have, and I don't think he's going to make an error that I can use. File. The supervisor is not the gap in this facility. He's the reason there aren't more gaps. I read that passage 3 times. She had identified, correctly, the competency she and I shared. She had assessed my threat level to her own situation accurately and filed it without flattery and without animosity. She had then noted, matter-of-factly, that I was not exploitable and moved on to looking for other angles. I found that, I want to be precise about this, I found that more unsettling than anything else in the 41 days of recordings. Not because it was threatening, because it was professional, because she had looked at me through a ventilation grill and assessed me the way I would have assessed a subject, cleanly, accurately, without rancor, and because the assessment was correct. I was competent. I had been doing this for 11 years. I did hold the whole space. And she had been watching me hold the whole space from inside a cell, and she had clocked it in 11 days. Not 14, not 20, 11. I filed my incident report at the 9th hour of that shift. It ran to 32 pages. The core findings were: Subject 7 Solis W had conducted an unsanctioned but non-operational intelligence collection activity over a period of 39 days, using no equipment, through a standard ventilation grill. The collection was comprehensive in scope and accurate in its primary findings. There was no evidence that the subject intended to act on the collected intelligence, but the collection itself constituted a security classification concern. The subject's behavioral profile indicated that the collection was likely automatic and compulsive rather than strategic. The subject showed no indication of awareness that the collection was being recorded. My recommended action: transfer to a higher security configuration, with acoustic dampening in the cell and a reduced aperture ventilation grill, and immediate consultation with the Behavioral Sciences Division regarding the development of new observation protocols for human subjects. The review board approved the transfer within the day. Solis was moved to sublevel 6, a deeper block, smaller grill, no corridor sightline before the end of the second shift. I was not present for the transfer, but the duty officer's report noted that she accepted the move without protest. She asked once whether she could bring her water ration allotment with her, was told yes and said, "Understood." Then she walked with the escort and did not look back at cell 7 Solis W. The duty officer noted that she spent the first hour in her new cell, standing at the new, reduced aperture grill, looking at the corridor. I completed the formal incident report over the following week, 49 pages in final form, with Vethorivseln's behavioral analysis attached as a supplementary volume. The behavioral analysis was the part that generated the most discussion at the review board, because it attempted to do something that turned out to be extremely difficult: name the trait. The Vethori taxonomy of observed behaviors has 1,742 classified categories. Threat-oriented behaviors occupy a substantial portion of them: aggression, dominance establishment, resource competition signaling, territorial marking, threat display, and so on. Vethorivseln went through the taxonomy looking for the category that fit what Solis had been doing. He found partial fits in several places: passive environmental assessment, threat landscape mapping, spatial orientation maintenance. None of them captured the full picture. The distinctions that mattered: the automatic nature of it, the compulsive quality, the fact that it operated at a level below what Solis appeared to consciously intend, the fact that it continued even when there was no actionable objective. None of those fit cleanly into existing categories. What Vethorivseln eventually proposed, in his supplementary analysis, was that humans might possess what he termed a permanently active threat assessment loop, a cognitive process that runs continuously, below the threshold of deliberate attention, and which treats all perceived environments as potential threat landscapes requiring active mapping, not because a specific threat has been identified, not because an escape is planned, simply because the organism evolved in an environment where the inability to maintain an accurate current model of the surrounding space had survival consequences, and where the habit of mapping never fully disengaged, even in environments that did not require it. The loop runs. It runs in safe spaces, in familiar spaces, in custody. It runs when there is nothing to do with the output. It runs because it is what the organism does. He noted, in the supplementary analysis, that this hypothesis would explain a behavioral pattern that the Terran Observer literature had documented but not satisfactorily explained. The tendency of human prisoners, across many different detention environments, to demonstrate detailed knowledge of their custody arrangements after relatively short periods of confinement, knowledge that exceeded what deliberate observation could account for, and which subjects often reported as not consciously compiled. The humans hadn't been casing their cells. They had simply been existing in them, and the threat assessment loop had done the rest. Vethorivseln's recommendation to the review board was that all human detention facilities review their passive monitoring protocols immediately, not for security breaches, but for this: the unrecognized accumulation of the subject's own intelligence collection in logs that no one was reading. He estimated, based on a sample review of the 3 other human subjects held in authority facilities at the time of the incident, that 2 of the 3 showed similar vocalization patterns in their behavioral logs that had not been reviewed. They did. The review board classified all 3 as observation protocol event type 7. New review protocols were established. Vethorivseln was asked to develop training materials for all authority facilities holding or expecting to hold human subjects. He spent 14 months on that work. The training manual was 230 pages. The core finding, stated on page 1, was: do not assume a human in your custody is not also gathering information about your facility. Assume the opposite. Assume they have been doing it since the first day they could perceive anything through any available aperture, and build your protocols from that baseline. The review board received the manual. Most facilities implemented it. Some did not, which is how, 2 years after the Solis incident, a second observation protocol event type 7 was flagged at a transit facility in the Orvith sector. A different human, a different detention environment, the same basic phenomenon. That human had been in the facility for 22 days. His behavioral log, when reviewed under the new protocols, contained a detailed working reconstruction of the facility's guard shift structure, its supply chain timing, and a set of structural inferences about the facility's connection to an adjacent processing complex that turned out to be, when checked against the actual building plans, 73% accurate. 22 days, less than Solis. Vethorivseln, when I told him about it, said he was not surprised. He said he was beginning to think 41 days had been slow. He thought Solis might have been being careful, or might have been spending significant cognitive resources on other processing, adjusting to captivity, managing stress, maintaining her own psychological coherence. The map building, he thought, was running on whatever bandwidth was left over. Whatever bandwidth was left over. I have thought about that framing often. I returned to Sublevel 4 and ran my sector for another 3 months before the formal inquiry concluded, and I was cleared of any operational negligence. The inquiry found that I had responded appropriately once the anomaly was identified and that the failure was systemic, an assumption, baked into our observation protocols, that the monitoring ran in one direction. We watch them. They sit there and are watched. The assumption was not unreasonable, given decades of operational experience with every other detained species in the authorities' history. It had simply never been tested against a species for whom sitting there and being watched was, apparently, indistinguishable from gathering information. The night the inquiry closed, I went back to the monitoring station in sublevel 4 and pulled up the current occupant of Cell 7 Solis W. New intake, a different species entirely, not a human. I watched him on the cell feed for a few minutes. He was sitting on the sleeping platform looking at the wall. I thought about what it would mean if he was not looking at the wall, if he was listening to the airflow patterns, if somewhere in that stillness, a process was running that I could not see, cataloging the shift change intervals and the patrol rhythms and the supervisor's inspection windows, filling a file that no one was reading. I found I could not determine from observation alone whether he was doing it or not. That was, in its way, the final note of the whole incident, the uncertainty. Before Solis, I would have sat in that monitoring station and watched a quiet subject on a cell feed and believed with professional confidence that the observation was mine, that the monitoring ran in one direction, and that I was on the correct end of it. After Solis, I was not so sure. I have not been sure since. I transferred out of sublevel for the following quarter. I told myself it was for professional development reasons, which was partly true. I took a position in the authorities' training division, where I contributed to the new human detention protocols and spent 2 years teaching the material to new facility staff. The first thing I told every cohort in the first session, before we got into any of the procedural content, was this: when you have a human in custody, the monitoring does not run in one direction. It never has. They are not sitting in your cell. They are sitting in a space they are actively mapping with everything they have, and they have been doing it since the day they arrived, and they will still be doing it on the last day of their detention, and the only question is what they are finding. The second thing I told them was that the human in the cell will not know this about themselves. They will not describe it as intelligence collection. They will describe it as thinking. They will tell you, if you ask, that they have been staying sharp, keeping occupied, noticing things. They will mean every word of it. The process is below their line of self-awareness. You will not catch it by asking them about it. You will only catch it by listening to what they say when they think no one is listening. The third thing I told them was Solis's note on the adjuster. Not a vulnerability to exploit, probably a decent individual who is carrying something heavy. I told them what it meant about the architecture, that the map-making runs automatically below intention, but the decisions made on the basis of the map are deliberate. That is the combination that should keep a Vethori detention officer awake at night. An organism that cannot stop gathering information, and that chooses what to do with it. Most of the trainees in those sessions came in with a version of the standard assumption, that detained subjects were static, reactive, contained, that custody was a one-way observation. By the end of the first session, that assumption was gone. A few of them pushed back. Surely not all humans were like this. Surely it was specific to Solis's background, her training, her particular disposition. I told them what Vethor of Seln had told me. The Orvith sector incident involved a logistics technician. Not a soldier, not an intelligence operative. A logistics technician who had spent 22 days in a transit facility and had reconstructed 73% of its structure from what he could hear while waiting to find out where he was being sent. That generally ended the pushback. In my second year of training work, I had a cohort that pushed harder than most. 8 new facility staff from 3 different authority installations, all experienced, all skeptical of what they perceived as an overcorrection driven by one unusual incident. The senior member of the cohort, a 10-year veteran named Setha Vorm, said politely, professionally, that the Solis incident sounded to him like a single exceptional subject, and that building a wholesale protocol revision around one outlier seemed like the kind of institutional overreaction that wastes resources and degrades operational efficiency with marginal returns on actual security. He had, he said, held dozens of human subjects over his career and had never encountered anything like what I was describing. I asked him how many of his human subjects' behavioral logs he had listened to in full. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had reviewed summary reports and flagged entries, as protocols at his facility specified, not full audio logs. I told him that was likely true of every facility he had worked in. I told him that was, with respect to his experience and his genuine competence, exactly the gap. It was not that the thing hadn't been happening in his facilities. It was that no one had been listening to the parts of the logs where it would have been audible. He sat with that. I told him to go back to his facility after the training concluded and pull the behavioral log for any human subject currently in detention, anyone, chosen at random, and listen to it in full, including all low-level vocalizations the automated system had categorized as noise grade. Not the flagged entries, not the summary, the raw audio complete. He did. He sent me a message 3 weeks later. The subject was a human civilian, held on a documentation dispute, 28 days into detention. The low-level vocalizations in his behavioral log, when cleaned up and reviewed in full, contained a running audit of the guard shift schedule, a structural inference about the facility's eastern wing derived from the sound profile of a door that operated on a different hinge type than the others, and a detailed behavioral portrait of the guard he had decided was the most competent on his block. Setha Vorm's message said, "I understand now. What do you want me to do about it?" I told him to implement the full monitoring protocol and to stop expecting that custody looked the way he thought it looked. I told him that every human his facility had ever held had probably been doing some version of this, and that the only question going forward was whether he was going to be reading the same data they were generating, or whether he was going to keep letting it compress into the archive unreviewed. He implemented the protocol. He became one of the better human custody operators in the authority's eastern sector. He sent me a note when he retired that said, among other things, that the most significant professional reorientation of his career had been understanding that the subject in the cell was not passive, that the observation ran both ways and always had, that the difference between knowing that and not knowing it was the difference between running a facility and only thinking you were running a facility. I kept the note. There is one more thing I want to include in this account, and it is not in the formal documentation because it does not fit neatly into the categories the review board uses. It is a personal observation. The notation on day 38, not a vulnerability to exploit, probably a decent individual who is carrying something heavy. I have thought about that notation more than any other single element of the 41 days. I have thought about it because it tells me something about the processing loop that goes beyond what Vethoriv Seln's behavioral analysis captured, something about the quality of it rather than just its existence. The loop does not run cold. It does not simply accumulate data. It runs through the data. It looks at a behavioral anomaly in a guard's stress response over a duty cycle, and it keeps going until it finds the person behind the anomaly, and then it makes a judgment, and the judgment is a human one. This person is not a target. Move on. An organism with a continuously running threat assessment architecture, and the built-in disposition to find the individual inside the threat data. Vethoriv Seln had said, "That is worse." He was right, not because it made her more dangerous in any immediately operational sense. She did not escape. She did not harm anyone. She did not do anything with the 41 days of intelligence she had gathered except murmur it quietly into a ventilation grill. But because it is, when you sit with it, a more complete picture of what the species is. The map-making is reflexive, architectural, as basic to them as thermoregulation. The judgment applied to what the map reveals is not reflexive. The judgment is a choice. She chose, on day 38, looking at the adjuster's stress data, to see a person and not a resource. The architecture runs automatically. The ethics are apparently deliberate. I am not sure what to do with that. I have thought about it for 3 years. I have not arrived at a clean conclusion. I am not sure a clean conclusion exists. What I know is this. For 41 days in a sealed cell in sublevel 4, Warrant Officer Dara Solis built the most accurate picture of my facility that anyone had ever assembled from the outside. She did it with no tools, no access, no cooperation from any quarter, and no plan to use what she was building. She did it because she looked at a space and a part of her reached out automatically and began to know it. And when she found, inside that knowing, a person she could have used, she put a note in the file and left him alone. I filed a report. I transferred her to a deeper block. I changed the protocols. The loop keeps running. I know that now.